Alexander Lee believed that everyone had a price. As the most feared mafia boss in the city, he spent 3 years treating his driver, Kim Kang, like a dog. He yelled at him, mocked his silence, and finally he fired him in the middle of a storm, throwing a stack of bills into the mud for Kang to crawl for. But as the driver stood up, he didn't look broken. He looked relieved. Within 60 minutes, Alexander's phone began to melt with alerts. His bank accounts were empty. His ships were seized. His empire was dead. Alexander didn't realize that for 3 years, he hadn't been employing a driver. He had been living at the mercy of the man who owned the city, and that man just decided to take his city back. The city of Seoul didn't sleep, but it did listen. It listened to the roar of Alexander Lee's engines and the screams of his enemies. At 38 years old, Alexander was more than just a billionaire. He was a shark in a suit of silk. He sat at the very top of a glass tower, looking down at the people below like they were ants. To him, power wasn't just about money. It was about making sure everyone knew they were smaller than him. He surrounded himself with men who were loud and violent, like his main enforcer, Jax. Alexander believed that if you weren't shouting, you weren't winning. But every morning at exactly 6:00 a.m., a silent man would wait by the car. Kim Kang was 45, rugged, and completely invisible to a man like Alexander. For 3 years, Kang had been the shadow behind the wheel, driving the dragon through the dark streets. Alexander saw Kang's silence as a sign of a weak mind. He thought Kang was just a man with no dreams and no spine. He never noticed that the driver was always watching the mirrors, not to check for police, but to study the man in the back seat. Alexander was about to learn that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous one, and the dragon was about to meet the man who owned the sky. Alexander Lee lived in a world made of gold and blood. At 38 years old, he was the king of the Seoul underworld. He lived on the top floor of a glass tower that looked down on everyone else. To Alexander, people were just tools. He wore suits that cost more than a house and drove cars that moved like shadows. Every morning, he woke up and decided who would succeed and who would fail. He was the dragon, a man with no fear and even less mercy. He spent his days in meetings with powerful men who trembled when he spoke. His life was a loud parade of wealth. He had bodyguards, expensive wine, and a cold heart. He believed he was a god because no one ever told him no. He loved the feeling of power. He loved knowing that with one phone call, he could change the fate of the city. But the more power he got, the more bored he became. He started to look for people to bully just to feel alive. He didn't care about loyalty or kindness. He only cared about who was on top, and in his mind, that was always him. From his high office, the streets below looked like tiny lines on a map. He felt like he owned every person walking on them. To Alexander, life was a game of chess, and he was the only player who mattered. If someone got in his way, he crushed them without thinking twice. He didn't want friends. He wanted servants who were too scared to blink. He believed that money could buy anything, including respect and fear. His heart was as hard as the diamonds on his watch. He never looked back at the people he hurt on his way to the top. As long as he sat on his throne of glass and steel, he felt untouchable. He was the king of a dark kingdom, and he planned to stay that way forever. For 3 years, Kim Kang was the man behind the wheel. At 45, he was older than Alexander, but he was always silent. He dressed in a simple black suit that never had a wrinkle. He never asked questions. He never complained about the late hours or the dangerous places Alexander went. Kang was like a ghost in the front seat. He knew every shortcut in the city and how to drive through a storm without spilling a drop of Alexander's coffee. Alexander treated him like a piece of furniture. He would talk about secret crimes and big money right in front of Kang as if the man had no ears. To the dragon, the driver was just a shadow that moved the car from one place to another. While Alexander sat in the back making deals that ruined lives, Kang just watched the road with steady eyes. He held doors open and carried heavy bags without a word. He was the first person Alexander saw in the morning and the last one he saw at night. Yet Alexander never even asked how he was doing. Over time, Alexander started to hate that silence. He thought Kang was slow or stupid because he never spoke up. He didn't understand how someone could be so quiet while living in the middle of a war for power. He saw Kang as a weak man who was lucky to have a job in such a grand mansion. To Alexander, A man without a loud voice was a man without any value. He had no idea that behind those calm eyes, Kang was doing much more than just driving. He was memorizing every name, every face, and every dark secret Alexander whispered into his phone. While Alexander looked out the window at the city he thought he owned, Kang was busy learning how to take it all away. The driver was a ghost, but he was a ghost that was writing down every sin of the man in the back seat. Alexander thought he was the one in control because he was being driven, but he never realized that the person holding the steering wheel is the one who chooses where the car finally stops. No one knew where Kim Kang came from. He had no family photos in his wallet and no friends who called his phone. He lived like a man who had no past and no future. Alexander's main guard, a mean man named Jax, often made fun of him to make the other bodyguards laugh. Jax would walk up to him and ask about Kang's parents or where he grew up, but Kang would only look at the floor. He never fought back and he never got angry. There was a mystery about him that felt heavy, like a dark cloud following him around. Sometimes, when the car was parked near the water, Alexander would catch Kang looking at the old docks with a very sad look in his eyes. It was the look of someone who had lost everything he ever loved. Some of the older workers in the city whispered that Kang used to be someone important, a man who once held great power. But whenever Alexander heard these rumors, he just laughed until his sides hurt. "He's a servant," Alexander would say while sipping expensive wine. "Servants don't have secrets. They just have bills to pay and floors to scrub." But there were moments that didn't fit the life of a simple driver. There were times when the way Kang stood made him look like a king in disguise. He never flinched when rival gangs drew their guns during a meeting. He never looked scared when the police chased them through the narrow streets at high speeds. While everyone else was sweating and shaking, Kang remained as cool as ice. He moved with a quiet grace that didn't belong to a man who spent his life opening doors for others. It was as if he was waiting for something big to happen. It was as if he was playing a part in a play that Alexander didn't know the name of. To Alexander, Kang was just a tool to be used and tossed away. He was too blind to see that the man in the front seat wasn't hiding from the world. He was waiting for the right moment to step back into it. Every time Jax pushed him or Alexander insulted him, Kang just waited. He knew that the best way to catch a dragon is to let it think it has already won. The tension in the city started to grow when a rival boss named Morty began to steal Alexander's business. Morty was smart and always seemed to know exactly what Alexander was planning before he even did it. Alexander became stressed and very angry. He could not understand how his secrets were getting out. Because he was frustrated, he started taking all of his anger out on Kang. One night, after a meeting went wrong, Alexander screamed at Kang for being only 2 minutes late to pick him up. The air was cold, but Alexander's face was hot with rage. He called Kang a lazy dog and told him he was lucky he was not dead in a ditch somewhere. Kang did not say a single word back. He simply stared at the road ahead, but his knuckles turned white as his grip on the steering wheel tightened. For the first time, there was a tiny spark of fire in his quiet eyes, but Alexander was too busy shouting to notice it. That same night, things got much worse. Alexander's best ships, filled with expensive goods, were stopped at the harbor. Someone had blocked all the legal permits and frozen the docks. Alexander was losing millions of dollars every hour, and his empire was starting to shake. He was losing his mind with worry. He blamed his guards, his lawyers, and everyone around him. He felt like he was losing control of the city he had worked so hard to steal. Alexander started to feel like eyes were watching him from every dark corner. He felt small and hunted. He sat in the back of his expensive car, shaking with fear and snapping his fingers at his driver to go faster. He did not realize that the man driving him home was the one who actually controlled the very air he breathed. While Alexander cried about his lost money, Kang drove through the rain with a face like stone. A massive storm was coming to wash the dragon away, and Alexander was the only one standing outside without an umbrella. The power was shifting, and the man in the back seat was the only one who couldn't feel the floor moving beneath him. The breaking point happened in front of the whole crew. Alexander was tired of feeling scared about his business, so he decided to show everyone he was still the boss. He called Kang into the middle of the large, cold garage. Jax and 20 other tough guards stood around in a circle, laughing and whispering. Alexander stood tall in his expensive suit, looking down at his quiet driver. He told Kang that he was too old and too slow for the job. He shouted that Kang was officially fired. But Alexander did not stop there. He wanted to truly hurt Kang's pride. He told Kang to get on his knees and thank him for the 3 years of food and shelter he had provided. When Kang stayed standing, as straight and still as a tree, Alexander's face got bright red with rage. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills. With a cruel smile, he threw the money into a deep puddle of dirty rain water on the garage floor. "Pick it up, ghost," Alexander hissed, his voice sounding like a snake. "That is more money than you will ever make again in your life." The other men laughed loudly as they watched Kang look at the money floating in the mud. For a long moment, there was total silence except for the sound of the rain hitting the metal roof. Slowly, Kang looked up. For the first time in 3 years, he did not look like a simple servant. He looked like a dark storm. His eyes were cold and powerful. He did not say a word, and he did not reach for the money. Instead, he turned his back on Alexander and walked calmly toward the exit. He walked straight into the heavy rain without looking back once. "Don't you ever come back," Alexander shouted at the top of his lungs, feeling proud of himself. He thought he had won the fight. He thought he had shown everyone who the real king was. He had no idea that by kicking his driver out, he had just opened the cage of a lion. As Kang disappeared into the night, the garage felt colder than it ever had before. Alexander felt like a giant, but he was actually standing on a mountain that was about to turn into dust. The next day, Alexander's world fell apart. It started with a phone call from his head accountant. All of his bank accounts were frozen. He couldn't move a single dollar. Before he could even yell, the police showed up at his front door. They held papers saying his glass tower was built on stolen land and he had to leave. By noon, his phone rang again. It was Morty, his rival. But Morty wasn't bragging or acting tough. He sounded terrified. "Alexander, someone is buying everything," Morty whispered, his voice shaking. "The docks, the banks, the police. One man just bought the whole city in 4 hours. We are finished." Alexander raced to the city hall, pushing through the crowds. He had to see who was doing this to him. He expected to see a giant company from overseas or a foreign king with an army. He stormed into the main office, ready to scream and fight. But when he walked in, he stopped. The mayor, a man who usually acted like he was the boss of everyone, was bowing low to someone sitting in a big leather chair. The man in the chair was wearing a suit so perfect it made Alexander's expensive clothes look like rags. The room was quiet and smelled like success. When the chair slowly turned around, Alexander stopped breathing. He felt like his heart had stopped beating in his chest. It was Kim Kang. But he wasn't the driver anymore. He didn't have the quiet, tired look of a servant. He sat with his shoulders high and his eyes full of fire. He was the chairman of the Addisa Group, the most powerful company in the entire world. In just a few hours, he had used his billions to buy every piece of the city. He was the man who now owned the banks, the docks, and the very ground Alexander stood on. Alexander realized with a chill that he didn't just lose his business. The man he had treated like dirt now owned Alexander's entire life. The ghost from the front seat was finally stepping into the light, and the dragon was nothing more than a shadow in his presence. "You're late, Alexander," Kang said. His voice was no longer quiet or soft. It sounded like a roll of thunder that shook the walls of the room. Alexander felt the strength leave his body. He fell to his knees on the hard floor, not because anyone forced him down, but because his legs simply stopped working. He stared up in shock, realizing that for 3 long years, the most powerful man on the planet had been sitting in his front seat. Kang had been hiding in plain sight, watching everything while Alexander acted like a fool. Kang stood up and walked slowly toward him. He explained that he had lost his own family years ago because of a greedy man just like Alexander. After that tragedy, Kang had promised himself that he would never be hurt again. He didn't need the driver's job for the money. He needed it for the information. He had spent every day studying Alexander, writing down every weakness and every crime the dragon committed. He was waiting for Alexander to show who he really was deep inside. He wanted to see if the mafia boss had a single drop of kindness left. "You thought I was dirt," Kang said, standing right over him. "But I am the ground you walk on, And today, the ground is moving. Kang reached onto the desk and picked up a single piece of paper. He held it out for Alexander to see. It was a legal deed that proved everything Alexander once owned now belonged to Kim Kang. His mansion, his fleet of cars, and his billion-dollar business were all gone in the blink of an eye. Alexander looked down at his own hands and started to shake. He had nothing left. Even the expensive suit on his back and the gold watch on his wrist belonged to the man he had mocked and insulted. He had spent years trying to make his driver feel small, but now he was the one who felt like a tiny ant. Kang wasn't just a driver who got lucky. He was a giant who had finally decided to stand up. Alexander looked at the man he had called a ghost and realized that the ghost was now the only thing that was real. His own life had turned into a bad dream, and there was no way to wake up. The room was silent as the truth hit Alexander like a physical blow. The powerful mafia boss began to cry, great heavy tears falling onto his expensive silk tie. He stayed on his knees and begged for mercy, his voice cracking with fear. He started talking about their 3 years together, trying to remind Kang of the time they had spent in the car. He hoped their history would save him, but Kang just looked down at him with a look of pity. It was the way a person looks at a broken toy that cannot be fixed. "I gave you a chance," Kang whispered, and his voice was colder than any winter wind. "Every single day, I sat in that front seat and watched to see if you had a soul. I waited for one moment of kindness or one spark of a good heart, but every day you chose to be a monster instead." Kang stepped closer, his shadow covering Alexander. "You didn't just fire a driver, Alexander. You fired your guardian. I was the only reason the other sharks in this city didn't eat you alive. I kept you safe while you insulted me. Now, you are just bait." Kang raised a hand and called for the guards. Alexander looked toward the door, hopping for help, but the men who walked in were not his anymore. Even Jax, the mean enforcer who loved to bully others, was standing behind Kang's chair. Jax looked small and terrified, knowing exactly who the real boss was now. Alexander reached out a hand, but no one moved to help him. Kang looked at his former boss and gave a final order. He told the guards to take Alexander out of the building. He told them he didn't want Alexander dead because death was too easy a way out. He wanted Alexander to feel what it was like to be invisible to the world. He wanted him to feel the biting cold of the streets and the sharp pain of hunger. The emotional weight of the moment crushed Alexander. He finally realized that his own pride had cost him a kingdom. He once had everything a man could want, and he threw it all away just because he wanted to feel big by making someone else feel small. As the guards grabbed his arms to pull him away, Alexander knew his life as the dragon was over. He was no longer a king. He was just a man with no name, heading out into a city that no longer feared him. A month later, a new driver sat behind the wheel of a cheap, rusty taxi in the poor part of town. It was Alexander. He was no longer wearing his fancy suits. Instead, he wore an old, stained jacket that smelled like cigarette smoke and cold coffee. He spent his long days driving people who were rude to him. They yelled at him for being slow and threw small coins at the back of his head when they were angry. He had to say thank you for every penny, or he would not eat that night. Every time he drove past the giant glass tower in the center of the city, his heart felt like lead. He could see the name Kang glowing in bright, beautiful letters at the very top. Under Kang's leadership, the city had changed. It was much safer now. The crime and the fear were gone because the man at the top was already rich and didn't need to steal from others. Kang had won the war without ever firing a single bullet. In his grand office, Kang sat quietly, looking out at the city he had saved. He did not feel like a scary boss. He felt like a man who had finally finished a very long and difficult journey. He had proved a great truth to the world. He showed that true power does not need to shout or be mean to others. True power is quiet, it is patient, and it always wins in the end. He had waited 3 years in the front seat for this moment of peace. Alexander looked into the cracked rearview mirror of his taxi and saw a ghost of the man he used to be. He saw the wrinkles of worry and the sadness in his eyes. He finally understood the lesson Kang had tried to teach him. He realized that being a leader means taking care of people, not stepping on them. But as the gray rain started to fall against his windshield, he knew it was a lesson he had learned much too late. He put the car in gear and drove away into the shadows. The driver was now the king, and the king was now just a sad memory. If you enjoyed this story of secret power and ultimate revenge, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more cinematic dramas. What would you do if you found out your driver was a billionaire? Tell us in the comments below.